See, I believe that we are perfect as organisms. We are born with all the needs, all the powers that we need to get our needs met, and that we get kind of waylaid along the way, that we get our energy distracted by adapting, by developing false selves. Remember last week we talked about this little kid. Here he comes into life and he's got spontaneity and feelings, and he's got the power to know and the power to love and the power to imagine. And very early on, he begins to adapt to the adults around him. Kids just know what's going on. And that's why they know if their parents are not emotionally stable, they know what to do. They know that they better adapt to survive.
Welcome back to the channel. In this week's clip, we're going to be looking at John Bradshaw. And for anyone who's not familiar with his work, if you haven't seen his series of lectures called Bradshaw on the Family or Bradshaw on Homecoming, they truly are life-changing works that you really should become familiar with, because I know for me personally, watching those series gave me such a profound understanding of my own motivations and how to correct some of them that it really became a life-changing experience to go through that series in its entirety. It's about 20 hours long, but it's worth every minute. We have Chris back with us. Thanks for coming again, Chris.
No problem. Glad to be here.
So let's play the first clip, and then we're going to break down a few bullet points that we've created around this clip, and then we're going to discuss how energy law is affecting what he's describing. Let's play the clip.
What compulsions are about is survival. We make the best decisions available to us at the time. These are our ego defenses. They are the ways that we survive what are more or less intolerable situations to us. Very early on, this child, this free little child, if you look at this one eating spaghetti here, this little professor figures out, hey, slow down there, little Sammy. We got to adapt, and we got to start controlling our feelings in order to please and literally manipulate these big giants. Very early on, this child begins to adapt, and the adapted part of the child has been called many things. Eric Berne called it automatic pilot or the ventriloquist dummy. It's like there's a voice in your head of parent tapes. If you have a very critical parent, a very judgmental parent, if you grew up with a very judgmental parent, you have judgmental introjects. That is, there are little voices in there that are telling you, sit up straight, you're going to be humpback, or you're not okay, or gosh, some of you just sat up. You see what that voice does? I mean, it's almost like when you hear the voice, you go automatic. Now, that's our mask. That's the mask we put on. That's the act. Or Eric Berne called it the script that we get into and the script that we live. But this little adapted child adapts to survive. It's life and death for this child. So the decisions you made early on in your life with this little professor part of you that could intuit the environment were the decisions that allowed you to survive, but what was left is this free little kid. This little kid that likes to belly laugh and spontaneate and make love and make noise and just be free. That child part of you, that most spontaneous part of you, for a lot of us was left behind. And we adapted in very rigid roles because we had these big, powerful moms and dads whose kid, their own adapted kid, was affecting our adapted kid. And as I told you last week, it's like a 180-pound 5-year-old and a 120-pound 5-year-old raising a 45-pound 3-year-old. If you want to know how we can get in trouble, to me, that chart will really say it to you. That the part of my mother and father that were never developed or were repressed, or their adaptations to survive, how they repressed to survive, their hurt, their pain, they then act out on me. And that's the way that this goes. We have to leave home if we're ever going to grow up, if we're ever going to have boundaries of our own, if we're ever going to be the person we were meant to be. So it's so important to understand how it can happen that we can't grow up, or we can't leave home, or we get caught up in these family systems. We get caught up in these rigid roles. So we don't know what our reality is. So you couldn't be mad, you couldn't be sad, you couldn't be glad. See, you become a walking uptight, in control of your body. And do you understand when you put the chemical in there, how you get out of control? And you get relaxed for the very first time. You're functional. For the very first time, you're functional. You can function. You can feel your feelings. You can dance. You can talk to girls. You can... I'm alive. I'm alive. So we wonder why those chemicals have such an attraction. Now, a compulsion is basically a mood-altering relationship. And what we know a lot about is alcohol, marijuana, cocaine. See, because the more mood-altering, the more euphoric the reality is, the greater addictive quality it has. That's why cocaine is such a terrible addiction. So it's a massive problem, but listen, it's an emotional illness. Do you hear that? That it is a way to manage emotions for people who can't get to their emotions, because this little kid in us is dead. He's hiding in the closet somewhere. That little freeze child with the spaghetti all over him can't get out unless he's high, unless he's doing something exciting. So the basis of drug addiction is not putting the cork in the bottle. That's behavior modification. That's okay. You got to put the cork in the bottle. You got to put the drugs down. You got to stop doing the drugs. But that doesn't cure the compulsivity. The compulsivity is the alienation from the feelings and the feeling of shame at the core of the person. The person feels inadequate, ashamed. And so you see, and of course the cycles of addiction are, the more I got drunk, the more I did shameful things, because I was dissociated from my shame. I had so much shame, I just got dissociated from it. So people would say to me when I was drinking, "Don't you have any shame?" The answer was no, dissociated from it, long time ago. Don't even feel it anymore. Don't feel nothing, man, till I drink. Then I can feel my feelings.
The adaptation he's describing is how we inadvertently create mental circuitry based on the environment we're raised in, and the fact that children have no power. They're completely powerless in that scenario, so they don't have a choice. They don't have the choice of leaving. So because they're trapped in that place, they need to figure out very quickly, what do I need to do to lower the resistance? Because if you have an incredibly abusive parent, you're going to not want that abuse to continue. So in a way, you end up becoming an enabler of the person's behavior, because you don't have a choice but to, well, if daddy's mad and I do this, then daddy stops being mad and I don't get to buckle into the belt anymore. And then eventually, as he's describing, this adaptation that you create out of survival becomes an automatic response that you carry on with you out into the rest of the world, and it's terrifying.
Well, it's a neural trap that seems to develop in our brains, where, you know, our brains are adapting constantly, which I think is something that we all need to be aware of, that there is no escaping action in your life and decisions. There are always consequences in terms of what is going on with the adaptive neural circuitry in your brain. Everything you do is your brain adapting to a new situation. And I think as children, everyone starts off creating circuitry that can very easily become a trap later on in life.
You have to leave home if you're going to become the person that you're meant to be. And then you look at the society we're living in right now, where you've got parents that are under a tremendous amount of mostly financial stress, because we are in kind of a downward spiral of the middle class. And then you've got all these young people that can't afford to leave that environment. So they've already adapted in their childhood to meet their parents' needs, or at least minimize the abuse of the parents. And sometimes it's just neglect even. And now we've got a societal situation where so many young people are staying at home until, in some cases, they're 30. And as he's saying, you cannot become your authentic self while you stay in that environment. And then you think about the long-term social implications this is going to have, because these videos are from like the late 80s, early 90s. And he had no clue what was coming.
Something I was thinking about in the last couple of weeks. I mean, my mom was born in 1950, and I was born in 1970, 20 years later, which seems to be pretty typical throughout, the last 100 years or so. That seems to be a fairly typical, age gap between mother and first child. And then my first child came in 94. So still fairly close. So 1950, 1970, 1994. So a little bit longer, but still just after 20 years. And my son is 30 now and no children. Living on his own, but no children. And, has to do a lot with the economy and just not being able to, at this point in Canada, afford to, have a home, and just does not feel secure enough yet to start his family. So you're like, wow, like, these are big implications here.
Yeah, and then they wonder why we have a population crisis, right?
He's at least out on his own, and he's 30, but he is living on his own and making his way and doing his best to build his life. There are many out there in their 30s that are still living in their parents' basements and could be there forever. Could be there from their 40s and 50s, and the transition just occurs where the parents stop taking care of the kids and the kids start taking care of the parents, but they never really are able to break out on their own.
And the long-term social implications of that, because the children, when it comes time to transition into caregivers for their parents, they don't have any experience in any of it, because they've had this prolonged adolescence that, from their late teens to their 50s in some cases, where what resistances have they overcome to be able to qualify them to take care of their parents in any way anyway?
It's interesting how life sort of gets us at the beginning, because at the beginning we're very unaware of what's going on, and the environment shapes us completely. All of us start off in that kind of a situation where we're children, we're doing the best we can, and the environment is influencing how our neural circuitry is being established. And then at a certain point, if we're lucky, we're able to get control of that circuitry and start to shape it with just the awareness and bring it under control. For those of us that we're lucky enough to be able to do that. You can begin to control your environment instead of having your environment control you. And your circuitry, you can start to, with your awareness, control your circuitry, build your circuitry to control your environment.
The resistance I had as a child was a very non-traditional one, because I wasn't raised in an abusive household. The resistance I had was that I was raised in isolation. Other than the time that I spent going to school, all of the other hours of the day, I was in the country with just my family, my two sisters, and there were no other children to force me into a social position. The kids you play with after school kind of forces you into a position in a hierarchy, but I never had that. So then when I moved into the town around the age of 13, I didn't have any of that social interaction programming. So I became completely isolated, and I just retreated into myself until I discovered alcohol, which was a wonderful day. And I can safely say that I drank once and I didn't stop for 20 years. Everything he's describing about that process of putting alcohol in your system and finding yourself again, I had that times 1,000 because of the resistance of the isolation that I had. And then it took 20 years for me to consciously become aware of what was happening, and through a whole bunch of other circumstances that forced it to me, for me to be able to, like you say, become aware of what I was really doing. And I haven't had a drink in 9 years now, but I did lose 20 years of my life to that habit that formed, because when resistance is constant, if current decreases, potential difference decreases. Well, for myself, because every time I was in a social situation, I perceived it as resistance, and I didn't have the ability to act, I developed this insane sense of powerlessness. And then if potential is constant and resistance decreases, current increases. So the way that I reduced the resistance of that social anxiety was through alcohol. And then it created this feedback loop of never feeling comfortable around lots of people and becoming comfortable around lots of people by reducing the resistance through alcohol. And then you got all this energy and you can do all the things that you're describing. And it is a hell of a trap, because we are a society in North America, for the most part, of functional alcoholics. Alcohol is the one thing that is not only acceptable, it is completely encouraged. And I think a lot of that does come from our childhoods.
That circuitry is very interesting because it is the oldest, and because it's the oldest, it's like a tree. It's the trunk. It's the largest branches. It's where it sort of pushes us. Alcoholism and drug addiction and all of these compulsivities, I mean, it's rampant through society, and it's very easy to see why. Some people become very successful with very traumatized circuitry, and some people don't. There's a lot of luck factor in that as well. Luck seems to be a big part of it. It's a randomized kind of crapshoot. It really does come down to just trying to become aware that this circuitry was so random at the beginning. And it really was just you fighting to avoid resistances and gain in these in certain potentials, and within your own environment, whatever that environment may have been, and that we have to be able to draw ourselves out of that with awareness and begin to control our circuitry.
And that's why the Bradshaw series are so amazing, because he breaks it down to, in 20 hours, he breaks it down to such a crazy degree that you can't help but see yourself in it. It's life-changing.
Groundbreaking. His work on it was definitely groundbreaking.
It's incredible that those are 30 years old and they aren't common knowledge, which tells you a lot about the established order of the world.
Well, yeah, it's just not talked about. None of this is really talked about. I think people have a hard time. I think as human beings, we're always looking for someone to blame. We're always looking for easy way outs, where we need to understand that every human being, no matter what is going on, we all started in the same place. And depending on how the circuitry was built, we end up wherever we end up. And I mean, it pulls into question a lot of things. Like, what are we truly responsible for? The environment creates us. Our only real hope with a lot of this is just to be able to bring people to an understanding and an awareness that this circuitry exists and that you can modify it. We need to be able to teach people more about this oddity about humans.
It's actually what you said a long time ago now in our private conversations. Our greatest strength has become our greatest weakness. The greatest strength is that we have this amazing ability to adapt. The weakness has become that we're constantly adapting whether we're aware of it or not.
Yes, no, that's it. And so we need to, as a society, create a societal awareness. And at a certain point, I mean, we need to be teaching everyone that, hey, you know, we are adapting continually. You have to look at the adaptations that are in your life right now and learn to modify those adaptations. Once you reach a point where you can become aware of the adaptations, you need to start pushing to switch from just the environment just randomly influencing your adaptations to taking control of your mind and adapting to change your environment. I think that's sort of the flip that has to happen in there. But it'd be a lot easier if that was taught.
Thanks for watching the clip. I hope you found it informative. Like I said, if you have never heard of John Bradshaw and his 2 epic lectures called Bradshaw and the Family and Bradshaw on Homecoming, they're highly, highly recommended. If you would like more information about any of this, please be sure to visit the website Seniorthinktank.ca. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you like this content, and we'll see you next week with the next clip.